I am Jamie Hilder. In collaboration with Brady Cranfield, I am a curatorial resident at 221A. Our exhibition, due to injuries, opened last night. It runs to October 19th. As part of the programming of that exhibition, I'm happy to have the opportunity to introduce Franco Berardi today. Before I do that, though, I'd like to extend some thank yous. First to the Canada Council for the Arts, also to the BC Arts Council, and to the Vancity Office for Community Engagement at Simon Fraser University. Some very special thanks go to the 221A and the people who work there. Brian McVeigh, Michelle Fu, Bopa Chai, Jay Yoon. It's been fantastic working with them over the last couple months. Thanks to the indefatigable Am Johal, as usual, and to the participants in our August reading group, who had a bunch of very interesting and enlightening conversations around the Uprising. It was a really nice way to spend Tuesday nights in August. And finally for Franco, for coming all of this way and being so generous with his time and ideas, and for the work that he does and will continue to do. And also to Brady for his seemingly endless patience with me, and for his ideas and his skills as well. The project that we developed for 221A and that we will continue to develop through this talk and through a series of response talks by Enda Brophy, Jaleh Mansour, Cecily Nicholson, and Steve Collis on October 1st and October 8th at 221A is largely concerned with what we are trying to understand as the economist's aesthetic. And by calling it the economist's aesthetic, we aim to piggyback a little bit on Le Corbusier, who in his book Towards a New Architecture coined the term the engineer's aesthetic to describe the dominant aesthetic mode of modernism. So it was in this text that he waxes poetic about the industrial aesthetic of cargo ships and grain silos, and introduces that kind of the fetishization of the notorious view from above. And what Brady and I are arguing is that when the engineer's aesthetic lapsed with the grand projects of modernism around the end of 1960s, early 1970s, it was the economist's aesthetic that emerged as a dominant cultural mode. So the metaphor of the machine that controlled the grand narrative of mass-produced internationalism yielded to the metaphor of the global market, and the engineer's tools of physical measurement gave way to the economist's computer modeling software. Now, part of our project involves an examination of how deeply that shift influences or limits our understanding of ourselves and our positions in the world. We're interested in locating the point at which it became comfortable to refer to education as investment, friendships as networks, love as a contract, the family as firm, the future as dividend. I remember at one point counseling a friend of mine that she would know it was time to leave a relationship when she wasn't getting a return on her investment. And I thought I was being wise, and I thought I was being helpful. So the question becomes, how did we end up here? How did we end up talking and feeling and thinking like this? And it's kind of a big question, and I really thought we would be closer to the end of it at this point. Brady and I have been thinking and talking about this for quite a while. But it's a difficult one. But part of our project aims to figure out how we might imagine beginning to think and speak outside of the cultures of finance capital. And maybe Franco can offer some suggestions, or maybe explain why we have found it so difficult to change. So that's not the task we want to lay completely on Franco, of course, but we're hoping, based on what we know of his work and his wider project, we might at least get a conversation started, and that conversation might enact a greater understanding of how the language of finance speaks us as much as we speak it. And Franco Berardi, as he himself likes to say, is a member of the last generation to have a future, or at least the last generation to have the kind of future that we feel a nostalgia for now. He is the founder of the journal E Traverso, the co-founder of the e-zine recombinant.org. He was involved with the Opporissimo movement in Italy in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and played a major role in Radio Alice, which was the first free pirate radio station in Italy. Over the past few years, he's made a significant contribution to the discourse surrounding self-organization and cognitive labor, particularly through appearing on numerous panels discussing the events following in the wake of Occupy and the Arab Spring, and also through his recent books, The Soul at Work, Precarious Rhapsody, After the Future, and The Uprising. His European School for Social Imagination was part of Documenta 13 and is currently transforming into a new format. He's going to speak for however long he feels like speaking, I guess. Imagine 40 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have some time for questions. We'll ask the audience raise their hands, and we'll come around with microphones for the recording. But we are pleased and honored that he has made the trip. And please join me in welcoming Franco Berardi.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Brady. Thank to everybody for being here. Well, my starting point, it's difficult, to talk in Vancouver because I have an idea about this city. I've been here before in 2001. I've been here in June 2001, just the month before the Genova G8 summit, which became, in a sense, the most violent moment of the experience of the global movement in those years. I remember I took part in a meeting somewhere in the city with people who were talking about the coming summit of Genova. And in that occasion already, I felt a sort of surprise because Vancouver for me is in a sense is a city outside of the game, in a place which is a lucky place, a sunny place also sometimes. If you are lucky, it's sunny. I've been lucky, and so I try to talk in Vancouver, but I'm not talking of a sunny subject. My subject is a little bit foggy, and by many points of view, it's also dramatic and yes. Well, my starting point is the movement in 2011. I take this year, I have a sort of fixation with years 68, 77, and 2011 is, in my opinion, if in the future historians will exist, I am not sure of that, they will probably talk about 2011 as a special moment in the history of social consciousness and in the history of the interminable, never-ending crisis of capitalism. 2011 has been, for me, the year of the uprising, the year of the insurrection, because I suffer from hallucinations, maybe, but I saw in that year the possibility of something. Remember what happens in London in November, December 2010. remember what happens in London in August 2011. Thousands and thousands of young people, unemployed migrants, going to the streets, taking to the streets, destroying everything in the city, talking with the despair, with the rage. And think about what happens in Spain in May, June 2011. 6 million people occupying the squares all over the country in the acampada that here. Think what happens in September in New York City, and then in Oakland, and in many other cities of the United States of America. Think of what happens in January, February, in Tunis, in Cairo, in Damas, and so on. You see, a sort of non-coordinated and fragmentary insurrection of a strange kind of crowd, of a strange kind of population. Someone would say multitude, coming out from nowhere and going nowhere. That's the point. Going nowhere. Because you know how the situation evolved in Cairo, for instance, just to name a city. Or you know that after the explosion of August in London, thousands of people have been jailed by the Nazi state called the United Kingdom. You know that what happened in Greece. You know that the Greek people have been pushed into a sort of abyss of misery, of despair, of social disgregation, of depression. And you know that after the uprising, a sort of dissolution, of sort of depression has taken the upside, has become the dominant tone, the dominant feature of the year 2012 and 2013 and so on. Why so? Why in Europe we have been unable to transform the rage and the energy, the subversive energy of the London students, of the workers, the public workers of Athens, and so on, why we have been unable to transform all these in a common process of social organization, in a common process of transformation of the European reality. You know what's happening in Europe now. Just in 2 words, I try to tell you what's going to happen in Europe. Look at Spain, for instance. You know that the Catalans are demonstrating because they want to be independent from Spain. They don't want to pay the debt instead of Madrid. They don't want to pay to Madrid the debt that Madrid has to pay to the European Central Bank. Someone says, okay, the Catalan independentists are democratic people, are peaceful people, don't worry, nothing too serious will happen. I know that the Catalans are democratic people. But in Madrid, fascists, Frankists are in power. And what happens in Spain is the beginning of a process of dissolution of the national unity, one country after the other. What happens in Spain today will happen in Italy tomorrow. And think of the hatred that is growing everywhere in Southern Europe against Germany. This danger, this hatred is the worst danger for the European reality. The coming back of the anti-German hatred is the poison which is preparing fascism, civil war in Europe tomorrow. We have been unable to stop this process. Like we have been unable to transform the Tahrir Square movement into a real process of self-organization of the Egyptian workers, of the Egyptian intellectuals, and so on. We have been unable. Why? Why? What is the novelty? Why the movement in Europe has been totally unable to stop the financial aggression? Why the movement has shown a sort of total ineffectiveness? I remember in the past, I remember in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, other movements that were not winning. Victory means nothing in the social sphere. But those movements were able to negotiate, to stop the aggression, to create forms of autonomy, of self-organization. Now we have been unable to do this, totally unable of doing this. And this inability has to be explained. And this inability has to be, this ineffectiveness has to be explained not as a political flow or a political lack of understanding. It's something more deep. It's something that belongs to the precarious existence of the new forms of work. What means precariousness? What is the precarity of work in its deep characterization? Precarity is essentially the total fragmentation of the social time, of the social body. Precariousness means that we never meet twice in the same place. Everybody is kind of atom going in different direction every day and never meeting the body of the other worker the next day. That means that it's impossible to transform the rebellion into organization. That means that it's impossible to create forms of territorial self-organization in the city and in the place of work. So we are 10,000 people on Saturday in the demonstration, but on Monday everybody is alone in his cubicle, in front of his computer, in his office, in his school, This is the new social reality that we have to face. And we have to be able to start from this point. Second novelty of the present situation is a sort of inability to impact really, to really face, to really meet the enemy, the financial capital which is destroying our lives. Why so? Because, there is a sort of displanarity, or I can say of spatial discontinuity between the movement and the power. Once upon a time, we knew that it was possible to face the enemy in the street, in the place of work, in the territory, in the real world, in the physical world. And it was possible to fight in a physical way, and so to stop the aggression, and so to start the process of negotiation. This is impossible nowadays, because our bodies, our physical reality is unable to meet the ghost of the enemy, which is nowhere. You can burn the bank if you want. It's an interesting experiment by the aesthetic point of view, but it's nothing by the political point of view, because the power is not there. It's not inside the bank. The real power is in the figures, in the algorithms, in the immaterial things that we cannot touch, that we cannot meet, that we cannot face, that we cannot stop. So, what happens now? Well, just a little parenthesis. I want to understand what is the new feature of power nowadays. I call it semiocapital. Semiocapital means, it's not so difficult to guess, semiocapital means a form of production which is essentially based on the elaboration of semia, of science, of immaterial things that are of virtual things, that are the form of value. In a sense, we can say that semiocapital is essentially a process of subsumption or of capture, of subjection, submission of our linguistic ability, of our cognitive force and activity. So cognition and also sensibility are the new field of production and the new field of valorization, and obviously also the new field of exploitation, of suffering, of contradiction, if you want. The aesthetics of the economy. That's a very interesting subject, which, let's think to the aesthetic genealogy of capitalism. Max Weber speaks of the relation between Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism. But capitalism, oh yes, he is right, of course. Protestant ethics is essentially the ethics of severity, of an iconic aesthetics, the aesthetics of seriousness, of essentiality, of truth, the aesthetic of truth. This is essential in the modern bourgeois connection between aesthetics and the economy, and production, and valorization, and salary. And, the Protestant ethics is based on the idea that it's possible to find a measure for the value, for the production of value, the unit of time. You start from time, and you can understand how much is the value of this, of that good. But when the main productive force becomes creativity, cognition, imagination, how can you determine a relation, a stable relation between time and value? How can you determine a measure? So, all of a sudden, I have the impression that the new reality of capitalism, the new aesthetics of capitalism, is more and more the coming back of the Baroque spirit. What is Baroque? Baroque is essentially the proliferation of the measure, the multiplication of the forms, of the shapes. In a sense, Baroque is the consciousness that God is infinite. So how can you limit the ability of God of invent things? This poor idea of truth, of commensurability, of measure, of honesty, which is the misery of the honest, serious, Protestant bourgeois of the capitalist modernity. This is over. You say Berlusconi is a liar. Yes, this is his potency. This is his ability to understand the new power is based on lie, not because they are bad guys. Sometimes they are bad guys, but because they understand that only the multiplication, the proliferation of shapes is the measure, the incommensurability of value nowadays. So we are facing a new reality of capitalism, which is impossible to contain, to territorialize, to oppose on a territory, in a determined space or time. Financial capitalism is part of it. It's part of the Baroquization of the capitalist aesthetic. It's part of the semio-capitalist transformation. What is financial capitalism? Once upon a time, finance was a tool for the accumulation of capital. It was a tool for, you remember, the credit and so on, was a tool for the enterprise. No more. In the old conceptualization of capitalism, you could say that I have money, I invest money in the production of goods, so I can have more money at the end of the process, right? That is the classical scheme that we know of accumulation of capital. It's no more the reality of financial capitalism, because financial capitalism, as we know very well, is I have money. I do not produce anything, so I have more money. How can it happen? How is something is difficult to understand in this process? Not so difficult. Because if you want to have more money, instead of producing something, you have to destroy something. It's that easy. So the accumulation of value happens differently from the times of Marx, who spoke, the poor guy, of plus value. We have to talk about minus value, a sort of negative, of entropic accumulation of money, thanks to the destruction of things. The modern, serious, Protestant bourgeois, and together with the worker class, have produced the universe of things we can destroy all that. And the process of privatization is the other face of this. Since Thatcher, 30 years ago, capitalists and economists and politicians have been saying everywhere that the main task of the good policy is to privatize the school, privatize the sanitation, privatize the transportation, privatize sex, privatize affection, privatize everything. How can they go on privatizing? What can they privatize more? We are producing during the day, and they are destroying the night. This is what is happening nowadays. In Europe, this is absolutely evident. All of a sudden, 4 or 5 years ago, we have been said, Europe is poor. How so? I don't understand. Europe is not poor. Europe is the place of millions of technicians, doctors, artists, workers, artisans, people who are able to produce the richness and the pleasure of daily life. Europe is the place where for 500 years cognitive and physical work have produced what now is privatized and destroyed. So the process of impoverishment of daily life there is totally evident. But after 2011, I have the impression that we have become unable to stop, to oppose this process. So my problem today is what is happening next, and also what is the next game. I try to describe the coming transformation, which is inherent in the process of submission of the cognitive energy, of the cognitive work. And I have the impression that we are shifting from a phase, or from a period of colonization of the psychosphere to a new period, which is a period of neuro-colonization, the construction of a sort of neuro-totalitarianism, which is based on the adaptability of the social nervous system, what is called neuroplasticity, if you want. Neuroplasticity is, in my opinion, the next big thing. In April, the President of the United States of America told that the most important project, scientific and technological project of the next decades will be the brain activity mapping. Wow, interesting thing. I remember the Genome Project, which has been a successful enterprise by the economic point of view and by the point of view of the creation of the condition for the biopolitical control and for the biopolitical transformation of the human body. A process, a process which has very progressive sides and very and very dangerous sides. But the brain activity mapping is something that concerns directly the main force of production of our age, the brain, the social, collective brain. Investigating, mapping the brain, the individual brain, means creating the condition for a new step in the process of neurototalitarianism, of direct control on the mind. Forget about prism and that kind of attempts in total control of the information. Privacy is no more the problem. The problem is directly the ability of the brain to produce and to be controlled by the power. But let's think about a visible aspect of this transformation. Let's think about the georeferential navigators that all of you have in your smartphone. I was in Seoul 3 months ago, in South Korea, and I was impressed by the fact that people are walking in the streets like that. They have small hands, so they need both to have their smartphone under control. And they walk like this, doing something, I don't know what. But the main thing is that if you stop someone and ask, please, where is that building? They answer, of course, doing like this. Well, I am thinking about the transformation of the human faculty of orientation. What is orientation? Orientation is the ability, the singular, individual ability to recognize the urban space, the territory, the world, in a personal way, starting from your own experience, from your own emotion. So, forget about it. Within a generation, the faculty orientation will be obliterated in the human mind. Orientation will no more be the ability to singularize the surrounding space. It will be the ability to conform to the common map, to the map. The map and the territory are no more two different things. The map is absorbing the territory, and for the human mind, there will be no more territory, only the common, the uniformed map. Think about Google Glass. This is the real neurototalitarian transformation. You will not need to experience things. You will not need to know the person that you meet, talking with her, understanding, imagining, fantasizing, supposing, and trying to create an emotional internal map of that object, that person, that place, and so on. You just will need to do like this, and to do like this, and to have the information about the world you are entering in. The world will be more and more a prepackaged, uniformed, non-expected experimental space, the space of well, forget about the neuro. Let's try to understand. You see, I am trying to find a way out. I'm just trying to escape, to find a possibility for saving something of the singularity, not because I am a romantic guy who loves the old things, no, but because I need the possibility of a process of singularization if I want to find the possibility of escaping the hell. That is my problem. So I try to say something about the relation between the semio-capital transformation of the world and that sphere of human activity which was called once upon a time was called politics. You remember what politics was? Politics was essentially the ability to decide between different alternatives, to criticize a prospect and to look for another prospect. But decision, critique, understanding, politics needs time for elaboration, time for singularization, time for decision. We don't have time. This is why politics has totally disappeared from the horizon of our time. And the ability to decide has been shortened and shortened and shortened. The time for decision is shortened as the infosphere is going faster and faster and faster. So you see, you are obliged to discriminate, to examine, to receive a growing number of stimulation, and the exposure of the increasing rapidity of the infosphere is cutting the time for the decision. So we are obliged to replace decision with automatisms. Automatism is essentially a strategy for deciding when you cannot decide, when you cannot discriminate. This is the reason why the social mind is becoming a sort of swarm. Kevin Kelly, in his beautiful book, Out of Control, someone probably remembers this beautiful book, and very, very sort of celebration of the neurototalitarian future that he likes, I mean, as a neoliberal, and it speaks of hive mind, of swarm, in a sense, of swarm behavior. What is the swarm? The swarm is a community of individuals who react in an uniformed way to common stimulation. It's a collective body who is composed by individual minds that are uniformed by the point of view of decision, who do not decide, but react in an uniform way. This is the swarmification of the mind behavior that we are living, that we are traversing, that we are experiencing nowadays. Well, this is This is the landscape that I see in our time. And as I am looking for a line of escape, I think that I am looking for a point of excess. The line of escape is the point where something is coming out from the frame, is breaking the frame, and I find this point of excess in the separation between the general intellect. At last I use this expression. I don't say the global mind. I say the general intellect. The separation of the general intellect from the body, from the social body, from the collective body, and also from the individual body. This is the point of break of the machine. I mean, this point of view this point of break is easily visible in the suffering, in the despair, in the epidemics of suicide, which is underway, especially in the last generation, in the epidemics of panic, in the epidemics of depression, which is the marking feature of the psychology of the daily life of the last generation. We know that according to the World Health Generation, the suicide rate has increased of 60% in the last 30 years. Notwithstanding the fact that many countries in the world forbid the declaration of suicide, notwithstanding the fact that doctors are invited by the authorities in Italy, for instance, not to admit the suicide unless it's absolutely necessary. There is a declaration of will of suicide. Well, interesting thing. In Southern Korea, you have the highest connectivity rate in the world. The number one in connectivity, Samsung land. Not surprisingly, by my point of view, Southern Korea is also the first place in suicide rate. By far, by very, very far. I mean, South Korea, you have 28.4 per 100,000 people who kill themselves every year. The second country in the world is Hungary. The third is Japan, and the fourth is Finland. Hungary is at 17. 28, 17. Well, a relation between connectivity and suicide has to exist. I don't want to be a determinist, but I think that if we want to understand the wave of psychic suffering, the wave of depression, we have to think about the separation of the body from the brain, of the physical, erotic body from the general intellect, this kind of hive mind, of automated mind, which is under construction. Well, I think that we have to start from this point, and I think that the next game is the game of self-organization of the general intellect, of self-organization of the body of the general intellect against neurototalitarianism. This is the next game. I know that the next game is going to take a long deal of time before becoming a conscious process of self-organization. I know that we still are walking in the darkness of politics, democracy, all this old shit that means nothing. We need time to become able to understand that the real game is the autonomy of the general intellect and the reconnection between the general intellect and the erotic body of society. What happens in between? What happens in the historical period, which is the coming period of history? What happens before the general intellect becomes able to find the way to reconnect itself with the erotic body of society? What happens next? This is why I'm not that optimist. I think that the tragedy of the neoliberal dictatorship is beginning. In Europe, we have seen the first glimpses of this tragedy. In Greece, we have seen the first glimpse of this tragedy. We cannot stop this tragedy. We have to start thinking about the next game. We have to be able to create spaces of autonomy, of good life, like it happened to me to find in Seoul. Seoul is, by many points of view, the most horrible place I ever seen in the world. A place which has been devastated by the Japanese colonization, by the Second World War, by the Korean War, by the Samsung dictatorship, by the highest rate of connectivity, and by a sort of desertification of daily life, of urban life, and so on. Nevertheless, I have been invited by a group of very nice people who label themselves autonomous researchers. And it's like, you go to the hell, and in the hell, you find a small room where nice people relax with air conditioning, maybe, and smoke marijuana, waiting for Satan, maybe. Thank you very much.
So we have time for questions, if there are any.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. My question has to do with how is it possible to sort of like speculate that this type of political economy, this what you described, is in a deeper level based on a type of philosophy of science, epistemology that has informed a particular idea of mathematics, then physics, and then machines that have risen out of this. In fact, what we consider like mathematization is a particular type of mathematization based on integers, discrete math, based on set theory. And that maybe not all machines are like this. Maybe this particular type of speeding is maybe we need another kind of speeding in a different dimension that can get us out of this. And what you're saying could fit into that as well. Or they can meet somewhere. Maybe capitalism is not the engine of acceleration as it pretends to be. Maybe it's actually like how some people argue, is only interested in a particular type of acceleration, particular type of no future that it can afford, and it can prolong its life, secure its longer life. Maybe there's a way to, of course the project is political, but maybe the project could also be scientific and philosophical, where maybe we can get out of this from a different angle as well, and work on it from a different angle.
Thank you. Thank you, because you are suggesting me two very important points that, in a sense, I could not discuss in my... The first one is, as you said, the process of, you used the word mechanization, of abstraction, let's say. The growing abstraction of the production process. Karl Marx speaks of abstract labor, but abstraction is not only that kind of abstraction. I mean, the indifference of the production of goods in relation to the use value and so on. We are living new levels of the abstraction process, one being the process of virtualization, as abstraction from the physical body, and the second being the financial abstraction. You know, the financialization of capitalism nowadays is based on the disappearing not only of the physical good, but also the disappearing of money. It's no more money, the abstract thing, but simply the algorithm referring to money. This is why I find so difficult to imagine a process of organization of the social body in the field of concrete life, because concrete life is unable to face, to stop, to dismantle the abstract aggression. It's what I call it displanarity or discontiguity, spatial discontiguity. The second point that I find interesting in your question is about the acceleration. We know that some brilliant philosophers and artists are talking about accelerationism as a possibility of escape. And it's interesting by many points of view, because it's in the line of the idea that in the tendency is implied the possibility. The Marx conception is all about that. I mean, Marx does not say we should go back to the old time of feudalism. He says, okay, capitalism is increasing the exploitation, the productivity, and so on. And in the beautiful pages of the fragment on machines, in the second volume of the Grundrisse, he says, the liberation from the exploitation, from the industrial work, is based on the acceleration of the rhythm of the machines. Thanks to the machine themselves, we will become free from the machines. Wonderful idea. Yes, yes, yes. But don't forget that when you say that in the tendency is implied the possibility, you are not talking of something that will happen. Possibility is not necessity. And the I am very much interested in Nick Land's ideas and in the accelerationist strange idea, but I think it's false. It's false. It's not true. because it implies necessity where there is possibility. So the possibility of transforming the acceleration into an orbitalization, a coming out from the machine itself, it depends on the subjective ability to create the condition for the slow life, because life is slow. I mean, the rhythm of the body, the rhythm of the mind, the rhythm of desire is not infinitely accelerable. Can I say accelerable?
But just as a footnote,
yeah.
I was going to add that, like, I particularly wasn't referring to Nick Land, but to the people who come out of Nick Land and criticize him, and the type of acceleration that I find interesting is not Landian. It's more like post-Landian, and it has more to do with people like Negar Estani and Ray Brazier and Benedict Singleton and people who wrote the Accelerationist Manifesto that was published a couple of months ago. And they make sure that they mention how they agree with you about the problems of the Landian acceleration. So I just wanted to add that footnote there, that, like, I completely agree with your critique of Land.
Hi. I'm curious, do you have any concrete strategies for how people might reunite the general intellect with the erotic body? Or is that we have to wait in hell for a little bit until we see how that can happen? Or so,
you know that I did not understand.
Oh, strategies for how people might reunite the general intellect or our intellect with the erotic body, as you were saying. How might we do that? What are your visions of that?
That's the question that I don't know. I don't know. I mean, this is why I say that we have to prepare to a difficult period, because there is no strategy for the self-organization of the general intellect. Like you should not translate the Leninist idea of creation of a strategy for the worker class into the field of the general intellect. It's not the same. It's not the same because look at what the Leninist problem was. The problem was those people, the workers, the industrial workers, are doing something that has nothing to do with their life. They are doing repetitive actions, gestures. They are obliged to that. They don't have any intimate relation with their daily life. So we can create a strategy, an organization, a political process, a revolution, which is outside from the factory, and then everything will change and so on. It did not work so well, but the idea was understandable, was sensible. No, now you are dealing with people who are intimately linked to their work. They are exploited, but at the same time they are exploited because they are giving their own life, their own soul. So the trap of cognitive labor is that you like what you do. You are expropriated of your real form of life, and you cannot create an organization outside of your... No, the process of self-organization of the general intellect will be, I say it in a metaphorical way, a platform, let's say a technical platform for the autonomization of what we are already doing. We are already doing what has to be done. We are already doing those things that can give happiness, richness, prosperity to the humankind. We have not to go in another place. It's already here. Problem is that it's entangled. I would say that the concept, it's not a strategy, it's just a concept. The concept is disentanglement, not subversion, not revolution. You don't need to subvert, you need to disentangle. You see what I mean? Taking it and bringing it outside from the tangle that. But it's a purely intellectual process. It's a process which belongs and pertains to the intellectual activity itself. We cannot shorten it. We cannot say, well, let's do it in 2 days, in a week, in 2 years. No, it takes all the time that it takes. The disentanglement of our... You know, I am really thinking that the problem is that what we do as doctors, informaticians, engineers, and so on, and poets, what we do is the useful activity. It's inside the useful activity of the cognitive work that the alternative can be found, but it takes the time that it takes inside the specificity of that work itself. There is no political shortening of the process, you see.
Thank you so much for your talk. I thought I was going to fall asleep, but I didn't at all. It was super interesting. But I'm really interested in the mapping of the brain to further the sense of disorientation and our faculty to orient in the space and based on experiences and feelings. But I'm wondering, so then what do you recommend we should be mapping? What histories? And also this idea of the colonization of the brain, and wonder if the neuro-decolonization perhaps could be a strategy, or if the neuroplasticity of the brain can be used against this neuro-totalitarianism that you're speaking about.
Actually, yes. I mean, I think that the concept of neuroplasticity is an interesting concept because it's totally open. What's the meaning of the word? That the brain is not specified. At the level of biological evolution of the brain, contrary to the deterministic idea that everything is implied in the gene, what we know is that the epigenetic process is continuously redefining the ability of the brain to map the territory. And so this is, I mean, this is what we know about the brain. We don't know so much, but this we know. Let's try to translate this idea of plasticity of the brain at the collective level, at the level of the social brain. Some interesting philosophers like Catherine Malabou are trying to redefine the relation between the unconscious and the brain. And Catherine Malabou says Freud has displaced the problem from the level of neurology to the level of psychoanalysis, from the level of the cerebrality to the level of sexuality, being sexuality the process of language, not only of sex. And now we have, in a sense, we have to go back to the pre-Freudian space. Not in the sense that we have to go back to the determinist, mechanicist idea of the neurosystem, but we have to recognize, think the Alzheimer, for instance. Think to the traumatic disorders. These are not psychological processes. These are neurological processes. I think that also the relation of the brain with the capitalist acceleration is also, but not only a psychological problem, it's essentially a neurological problem. The collective brain is unable to go so fast, is unable to be autonomous, singular, and at the same time to follow that rhythm. This is producing psychopathologies that are not part or cannot be only explained in terms of psychoanalytic suffering. They have to be explained in terms of neurological disturbances, of neurological disease, redefinition, and pathologies. So they are not psycho, but neuropathologies in a sense. I know that there is a very dangerous outcome of such an idea, which is the idea of adaptation. I mean, the idea that we are suffering, but there is the possibility of redefine, of manipulate the brain so that it becomes able to face the acceleration. What is already happening with the psychopharmacological tools, you know? Prozac is the way to face an acceleration, precarization, and the unhappiness that capitalism is producing in our lives. So this is the dangerous outcome of the neuroplastic thing. I'm saying what you say. I mean, there is an ambiguity in the concept of neuroplasticity. We have to accept this ambiguity. We are forced to accept this ambiguity. We are forced to start, I mean, we have to create a sort of psychoanalytic and political ability to deal with the suffering in a way which is not only healing the individual brain, but is also disentangling the collective brain from the capitalist angle. Brady.
I see the fundamental kind of human evolution as a basis of pretty much a categorization, like you said, like a mapping of the human genome, or maybe just our kind of this fascination with categorization. And I think you kind of touched on a point where sorry, I'm trying to collect my thought. So I think you touched on this basis that the categorization is a very kind of a skeptical, you have a very skeptical point in the mapping of the human genome in the brain. And I feel that maybe technology gets in the way of why exactly the human brain is thought to be even mapped. Maybe this might become a very antiquated idea within maybe 1,000 years, just as in the way that the Earth might be flat, or is that even a possibility that it can be mapped? And in terms of how you said the suicide rate in South Korea and tech being the most connected in the world, there's some kind of a correlation with it. And when you come to the point where you're using technology in order to map out everything or attempt to map out everything, you become only mentally articulating the world around you rather than physically. And I want to know how this ties into this idea that what can we do in the physical world in order to compensate for so much of the mental aspect of, sorry?
In order to?
In order to physically articulate our surrounding versus a mental kind of way of ideal. Because technology becomes this completely trusted thing in our world, like you said in a Google Glass, or something about technology being so reliant. Prepackaged experience. So I want to know what your skepticism is in terms of technology, if you are skeptical of where technology is going.
I'm not skeptical.
Okay.
I'm not skeptical when I talk of the mapping of the genome. I'm not skeptical when I'm talking of mapping the brain. I'm frightened, which is different. You know, the genome mapping, the genome project, has produced very effective results by the point of view of knowledge and by the point of view of therapeutic technologies and so on. And it's good by many points of view. And it's dangerous by other points of view. When it comes to the brain activity mapping, I see also the possible usefulness of this mapping, but I mostly see the dangers of it. Because I'm not thinking to this process of mapping in an abstract situation. I see this process in the conditions of capitalist exploitation of the cognitive work. For instance, all the Snowden and Prism, and then the problem of privacy and the control. I don't think that it's really a problem of privacy. I think that it's essentially a problem of penetration of the global exchange of information, of stimulation. It's something which has very much to do with the traceability of our productive and consumptive abilities. This is the real danger implied in Prism and in that. So the brain activity mapping is going in the direction of a neuro control of the cognitive energies. At the same time, I know that it's not a process that I am skeptical of. I know it can be effective, it can be dangerous, it can be also the beginning of a process of self-knowledge of the collective brain itself. It depends on the social and also, on the empathic conditions of this process. I mean, it depends. If social solidarity is the frame in which this process happens, it's going to be good. If competition is the frame, it's going to be very, very bad. And I see that competition, profit, exploitation is the frame of this process.
Thanks for your talk, Franco. Hello. Hi. Hi. Well, I'll just follow you around the auditorium otherwise. I'm wondering if I could, just because you're working on the relationship between finance, capital, and poetry, I'd love to get you to speak about poetry.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk a little about poetry, because I'm thinking that maybe as a way to start off, some thoughts would be just to think about if you could explain or elaborate on the decisions behind talking or choosing the term of semio-capitalism, because everything that you're talking about in regards to financial capitalism suggests that we're not talking really about a relationship of representation that we'd normally associate with the idea of semiotic activity. So what the quality of the semiotic activity would be in a time under capital which has no time for representation, allows no time for representation. What does poetry do for you in that moment, right? So in this, where it's both appropriated and disallowed in some sense, I think.
Yes. Talking of poetry and finance is paradoxical by many points of view. So it's a metaphor just up to a point, but it's not only a metaphor. Let's look at what poetry has been during the last century. Not only poetry, art in general. Poetry and art in general has started from the condition of representation, and little by little, starting, let's say, from the French symbolism, the French impressionism also, it has become an activity of evocation, of creation of the world in many senses, by many points of view. Mallarmé says, I don't want to say the rose. I want to evoke the rose. I want that the rose comes out because of my voice. My voice is creating the thing. The physicality, the erotic energy of my voice is creating the poetical world. So, in a sense, Mallarmé and futurism and the thread of abstraction, of essentialism, and of symbolism, different threads going in the same direction, this thread has created the possibility of understanding and also of imagining the possibility that the language creates a word. In the field of poetry, but also in the field of the economy. Because what is the difference of financial capitalism? The ability of language to create the word. The ability of self-referential acts of language to create expectations, fears, and financial collapse or corporation profits and so on and so on. So this is the metaphorical, up to a point, emancipation of the sign that the poetry has made possible. When the sign, the word, the figure, the linguistic product becomes emancipated from the word, it becomes able to create its own word. Virtuality is all about that, so I am not saying something so strange. But this is only the first part of the story. This is the past. This is what has happened during the past century, and I don't want to say that Mallarmé is guilty of the Wall Street domination of the world, of course, but I think I don't call poets as guilty of something. No, but I think that poets have a power, and this power now can play another game, a different, almost a subverted game. What is the game that poets, artists can play in the coming time? In my opinion, is the game of reactivation of the erotic body of society. If poetry and art have been a force of abstraction during the last century, now it has to become a force of reconcretization, which does not mean coming back of the representation. It's not a claim to the realistic power of the linguistic representation. It's, Giorgio Agamben says in a book titled Language and Death, he says that the voice is the meeting point of meaning and flesh. It's true. I mean, the voice, not the language, the voice is the singular erotic point of contact, of meeting, of the meaning and of the body. This is my intuition, that art can become the process of reactivation of the relation between the body and the meaning. Meaning, in this case, means many, many things. It's not only meaning as the content of language, it's the word. So the relation between the singularity, the erotic singularity of the voice and, this is clear when you come to think to what is a mantra. What is a mantra? Mantra is the collective emission of energy. Mantra has the ability to create a common energy which is, in a sense, destroying the walls of Jericho. That is the power of the mantra. And at the same time, mantra means solidarity. Mantra means the ability to breathe together, to find a common energy of invention, not only of the social process of transformation, but also of the social process of production, of the world. This is, you see, the double face of the relationship between poetry and finance. Abstraction in the past, and maybe the coming back of the body in the future time.
I wanted to ask about, so the ideas you've outlined in your talk and neurototalization seem to me to be very pertinent and visible in the Western world. And I wondered if you might speak more to the question of how that relates to what we might see as processes of primitive accumulation that have re-emerged in parts of the post-colonial world. How your ideas relate to that.
Well, I'm very cautious when I hear the word post-colonial, because it can open some ambiguities of understanding. A process of colonization belongs to the past, and a different process of colonization belongs to the present. The present colonization is essentially a colonization of the psychological and also neurological dimension. So, for instance, also the distinction between West and East, or West, North and South, starts to become more and more problematic, at least. Because we are already in a dimension of deterritorialization of the process of production, of the process of affectivity, and so on. Think to an aspect that for me is absolutely crucial in the present, if we want to understand the new forms of colonization, which is the massive migration of affective and sexual work. Particularly think to the millions of women who are leaving Manila, Nairobi, to go to New York City or Milano, where millions of women are leaving every day their children alone and go to work in their office. I am not calling the mother to her holy role. I simply am pointing and trying to understand what kind of psychic bomb we are producing in the mind of those millions of children who are talking with, it's the problem of colonization now is essentially the problem of language. The relationship between language and the body, which is the body is the gate, the door of entrance to the language. The access to language has always been the relation with the body of the mother. Now the body of the mother is dissolved and replaced by the screen, by the machine, or by the displaced neocolonial body of a mother who has left her children in Manila and in Nairobi. You see how difficult it is to talk about post-colonial.
Do you see a link to, what about the mother who is still in Nairobi? How does the theories that you've outlined today, what consequences do they have for the life of many people on, say, the African continent?
Yeah, but the mother who still is in Nairobi, more and more listening to the same music and communicating in the same Facebook than the mother who is in Manhattan and in Milano. This is, the imaginary world of the global mind today is less and less a territorial space. I don't want, it's not a subject that I am very familiar with, but I tend to see the problem of post-colonial in terms of neo-colonial as essentially mental, virtual colonization.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Franco. Thank you, everyone.